The night I pressed play on that recording, I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel the burning, chest-tightening fury I had braced myself for. What I felt was something far more devastating. A quiet, hollow grief that settled into my bones like the cold Charlotte winter outside my kitchen window. I sat at that table for a long time, the small digital recorder resting between my hands like a stone. My reflection caught faintly in the dark window glass across from me. A man I almost didn't recognize. 64 years old, retired, alone, and apparently a fool. The voice on that recording belonged to my daughter. Her name is Simone Elaine Beaumont. She is 31 years old. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's smile, and for most of her life, I believe she had her mother's heart too. I had given her everything: private school tuition in Myers Park, a full ride to Hampton University, the down payment on her first apartment in Noda. I gave her everything her mother and I had built over 40 years of sacrifice, and I did it willingly, proudly, without a single condition attached, because that is what fathers do. That is what this family does. So when I heard her voice through those cheap foam earbuds say, "Daddy won't even notice. He's too old to keep track of that money anyway," something inside me didn't break. It calcified. It turned from warm flesh into something harder, clearer, colder. And in that moment, I made a decision that would change both of our lives forever. But before I tell you what I did next, I need you to understand something. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop it below. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that truth always finds its way to the surface. And leave a like if you know that a parent's love should never be taken for granted. Because this story is for every father, every mother, every person who's ever loved someone completely, only to wonder if that love was ever truly returned. Let's go back to where this began, 4 months before that night in my kitchen. Back to a Tuesday morning in October, when the world still made sense. My name is Theodore Raymond Beaumont. I spent 38 years as a senior structural engineer at Carolina's Healthcare Systems Facilities Division in Charlotte, North Carolina. I retired at 62 with a pension that paid out $4,850 a month, a 401k worth $612,000 held at Fidelity Investments, and a paid-off colonial on Sherwood Avenue in the Eastover neighborhood, the same house where Simone took her first steps, where we celebrated her high school graduation, where we buried her mother, my wife Patricia, 3 years ago after a battle with ovarian cancer that lasted 18 months and never once broke her spirit. Patricia Ruth Beaumont was the kind of woman who made every room she entered feel like it had been waiting for her. She sang in the choir at Little Rock Ames Zion Church on Beatty's Ford Road every second and fourth Sunday. She made sweet potato pie from scratch on Thanksgiving, and she never, not once in 36 years of marriage, went to bed angry. When she passed in November of 2022, she left behind a hole in this house that no amount of time has fully filled. She also left behind specific instructions, written in a letter she gave our attorney, Roland Hutchins, at Parker Poe Law Firm on South Tryon Street. Patricia's letter asked one thing of me: "Theo, let Simone help you. She's good with numbers. Don't be too proud to lean on your child. That's what family is for." So I did. God help me. I did exactly what my wife asked. 6 months after Patricia passed, Simone came to me with a proposal. She had just completed a financial planning certification course at Queen's University of Charlotte, and she suggested that we consolidate the management of my retirement accounts into a joint oversight structure, her words, not mine, so that she could help me monitor investments, track distributions, and plan for long-term care needs. She brought a folder with color-coded tabs. She wore her mother's reading glasses that she'd inherited. She looked so much like Patricia sitting across from me at that kitchen table that I signed every form Roland put in front of me without reading a single one closely enough. That was my first mistake. And looking back now, with the clarity that only hindsight provides, I can see that there were signs even then. Small things. The kind of things a proud father dismisses because he doesn't want to believe what his gut is quietly telling him. The first sign came 3 weeks after we set up the joint account structure. Simone called me on a Wednesday evening and mentioned, almost as an aside, that she had spoken to my financial advisor, a man named Gerald Okafor at Raymond James on Fairview Road, and had suggested he reduce my monthly distribution from the 401k by $800 to preserve capital. Gerald had called me to confirm, and I told him to proceed because Simone had framed it as something she and I had already discussed. We hadn't. I assumed I had forgotten. I was 63 and grieving and tired. I gave myself the benefit of the doubt instead of giving it to my own instincts. The second sign came 2 months later at Christmas dinner. Simone's boyfriend, Devin Ashford Price, joined us for the first time. Devin was 34 years old, originally from Columbia, South Carolina, and worked or claimed to work as a private wealth consultant for a boutique firm called Pinnacle Capital Strategies, LLC, which I later discovered had no verifiable office address and a website that had been registered just 11 months prior. Devin was charming the way a salesman is charming. He complimented my house. He praised my cooking. He asked me detailed questions about my retirement accounts, how they were structured, what institutions held them, what the penalty schedule was for early withdrawal, and I answered honestly because I thought he was asking the way a man does when he's considering the future and thinking about family. I thought he was thinking about marrying my daughter. He was thinking about something else entirely. The third sign, and this one I am not proud of missing, came in February when I reviewed my quarterly fidelity statement and noticed that my account balance had dropped by $23,000 from the previous quarter. The markets had been volatile, yes, but not volatile enough to account for a loss of that magnitude in a conservatively allocated retirement portfolio. I called Gerald, who seemed genuinely puzzled. He told me there had been 2 authorized distribution requests submitted through the joint account portal in January, one for $11,500 and one for $11,500, both approved under my digital signature, which Simone had been granted authorization to use on my behalf through the power of attorney documentation we had signed the previous summer. I asked Gerald who had initiated the requests. He hesitated. Then he said, "Mr. Beaumont, the requests came through Miss Simone Beaumont's login credentials." I remember exactly where I was standing when he said that. I was in my garage, next to Patricia's old Volvo that I still hadn't gotten around to selling. The February light was thin and gray through the side window. I thanked Gerald, told him to flag any future distributions for my personal verbal confirmation before processing, and then I stood in that garage for a long time looking at Patricia's car. I did not call Simone, not yet. I am not an impulsive man. 38 years of engineering teaches you something fundamental. Before you tear down a wall, you need to know whether it's load-bearing. Before you make an accusation that cannot be taken back, you need to understand the full structure of what you're dealing with. I had a suspicion. I needed evidence. And I needed to understand the scale of what might be happening before I said a single word to anyone, including my daughter. So I started paying closer attention. What would you do if you discovered the person you trusted most had been quietly taking from you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear from you. Over the next 3 weeks, I pulled every financial statement I could access and laid them across the dining room table in chronological order. I am a man who spent 4 decades reading blueprints and load calculations, and I applied that same methodical precision to what I found spread before me. The picture that emerged was not pretty. Between July and February, 8 months, a total of $47,300 had been moved out of my retirement accounts through a series of small, staggered withdrawals ranging from $3,200 to $11,500. Each transaction had been submitted through the joint portal using Simon's login credentials and my delegated digital signature. Each one had been categorized under a generic memo field that read either personal distribution T. Beaumont or investment transfer authorized. None of them had been flagged because they fell below the threshold that would have triggered an automatic alert under my account settings. Settings that, I now realized, had been quietly adjusted sometime in the previous September. The money had been transferred to a checking account I didn't recognize. The routing number traced back to a regional credit union in Rock Hill, South Carolina, about 30 minutes south of Charlotte. I had no account at that institution. I had never opened one. I sat with this information for 2 days. I prayed about it. I called my oldest friend, a retired pastor named Reverend Cornelius Whitfield, who has known me since our days together at Johnson C. Smith University, and I told him what I had found without using Simon's name. Cornelius listened the way he always does, with patience and without judgment. And when I finished, he said, "Theo, before you do anything else, you need to know the whole truth, not just the numbers, the conversation." That was when I drove to an electronics store on South Boulevard and spent $1.89 on a small voice-activated digital recorder, the kind that fits in the palm of your hand. I brought it home, charged it overnight, and the following morning, while Simone was coming over for what she called our regular Sunday check-in, I placed it inside the hollow base of the decorative clock on the living room mantel, the one Patricia had bought at an antique market on Central Avenue years ago. It sat behind a small brass plate, invisible unless you were looking for it specifically. I had tested the sound range the night before. It picked up clearly from 14 feet. Simone arrived at 11 that Sunday morning with Devin. This was the first time he had joined her for one of our check-ins, and I noticed it but said nothing. We had coffee. We talked about the church's upcoming anniversary celebration. Devin sat in the armchair by the window and scrolled his phone while Simone and I reviewed what she described as a portfolio rebalancing summary she had prepared on her laptop. I asked questions. I kept my voice even. I kept my face open and trusting, the way it had always been with her, because I needed her to feel safe. I needed her to believe that I was still the same man I had been 6 months ago, before I started counting. After about 40 minutes, I excused myself to the kitchen, telling them I was going to make a second pot of coffee. I moved slowly, the way a 64-year-old man moves, the way my daughter expected me to move. I stood at the kitchen counter with the coffee maker running, and I listened. The living room went quiet for a moment. Then I heard Devin's voice, low and confident. He didn't ask about the Rock Hill account. Simon's response came quickly. He doesn't know about it. He barely checks the detailed statements. He trusts me. Devin said something I couldn't fully make out. Then Simone said the words that I would replay 11 times that night. Daddy won't even notice. He's too old to keep track of that money anyway. By the time we move the rest of it, he'll just think it was market losses. I stood at that kitchen counter and poured 2 cups of coffee I didn't drink. I brought them back to the living room with a smile. We finished the meeting. I walked them to the door. I hugged my daughter the way I always did, holding her for a second longer than usual, because part of me, the part that is still her father, that will always be her father, needed that moment. I watched Devin's silver Audi a 5 back out of my driveway and turned south on Sherwood Avenue. Then I went to the mantel and I retrieved the recorder. That night, sitting alone in my kitchen with the recorder in my hands and Patricia's voice somewhere in the walls of this house, I made a list. Not a list of grievances. Not a list of punishments. A list of steps. Measured, deliberate, and final. I called Roland Hutchins first thing Monday morning and scheduled an emergency appointment for Tuesday. I spent Monday evening making copies of every financial document I had, printing statements, photographing records on my phone, emailing PDFs to a private Gmail account I created that evening and shared with no one. By the time I sat down in Roland's uptown office on Tuesday afternoon, I had brought with me a manila folder containing 47 pages of documentation, a USB drive with the audio file from the recorder, and a question I needed answered before I could take another step. "Roland," I said, setting the folder on his desk, "tell me what I'm dealing with." Roland Hutchins is 68 years old, a Morehouse man, and has been practicing estate and financial law in Charlotte for 31 years. He opened the folder. He reviewed the statements. He plugged the USB drive into his laptop and listened to the recording with his office door closed and the expression on his face changing slowly from neutral professional to something much colder and more serious. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and took off his glasses. "Theo," he said, "what you have here is a clear pattern of unauthorized financial exploitation. The recording, combined with the transaction records, constitutes substantial evidence of elder financial abuse under North Carolina General Statute Chapter 14. He said the words, elder financial abuse, and something inside me shifted. I was 64 years old. I had run ultramarathons in my 50s. I had overseen construction projects involving hundreds of thousands of square feet of medical infrastructure. And yet here I was, legally categorized as a vulnerable adult whose own daughter had allegedly chosen to exploit the trust he had extended to her in his most vulnerable years. Roland gave me 3 options. I chose the one that required the most patience. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone completely and then had to question everything? Leave your answer below. And if this story is speaking to your heart, please subscribe and leave a like. It means more than you know. The following 6 weeks were the longest of my life. Roland filed a formal complaint with the North Carolina Adult Protective Services and coordinated with a forensic accountant named the Dr. Beverly Stokes at a firm on Morrison Boulevard, who spent 3 weeks tracing every transaction that had moved through my accounts since Simone had been granted access. The final number, when Dr. Stokes presented her report to Roland and me in early November, was $61,750, not the $47,300 I had initially identified. The full amount, including several early transactions I had missed, was $61,750, moved over 14 months through the Rock Hill Credit Union account into a joint account that Simone and Devin held together at Truist Bank on Main Street in Rock Hill. Roland also discovered that the account settings on my Fidelity portal, specifically the alert thresholds, had been changed on September 14th of the previous year. The IP address associated with that change, which Gerald Okoffer's compliance team at Raymond James was able to pull from their system logs, matched the registered location of Devin's apartment on South End in Charlotte. Devin Ashford Price, the man my daughter had brought into our home, into our check-ins, into my kitchen for Christmas dinner. The man who had asked me all those careful questions about penalty schedules and account structures. He was not a private wealth consultant. He was a man with a scheme and a willing partner, or perhaps the more frightening possibility, a man who had found in my daughter something he could shape into one. I did not know which was true. I was not certain it mattered in the way I once thought it might. What I knew was this. I had $61,750 of documented losses, a recorded conversation admissible under North Carolina's one-party consent law, a forensic accounting report, IP address logs, and an attorney who had been practicing since before my daughter was born. I also had something Devin had underestimated from the very beginning. I had time, and I had patience. And I had absolutely nothing left to lose by waiting until every piece was exactly where it needed to be. The week before I made my move, I did something I hadn't done in months. I drove to Little Rock Ames Zion Church on a Wednesday evening, not for a service, but just to sit in the sanctuary alone for a while. The custodian, Brother Earl Simmons, who had known Patricia and me since the early 90s, let me in without a word and left me there in the third pew from the front on the left side. Patricia's pew, with the late afternoon light coming through the stained glass and laying colors across the worn oak floor. I sat there for 45 minutes, and I thought about my daughter, not the woman on that recording. The girl who used to fall asleep in this very pew with her head against my arm during the long sermons. The girl who sang in the junior choir in a yellow dress her mother had made by hand. The girl who called me from Hampton University during her freshman year crying because she missed home and I drove 6 hours each way just to take her to dinner and drive back. I thought about that girl for 45 minutes, and then I stood up, smoothed my coat, nodded to Brother Earl on my way out, and drove home to make the phone calls I have been preparing to make for 6 weeks. The first call was to Gerald Okafor at Raymond James. I instructed him to quietly revoke Simon's access to all of my accounts effective immediately, citing a routine security review. Gerald, who by now understood the situation through Roland, processed the revocation that same afternoon without any notification being sent to Simone's email. Another detail, Roland had arranged through the account's administrative protocols. The second call was to Dr. Beverly Stokes, confirming that her forensic report was finalized, notarized, and ready for submission to both Roland's office and the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Financial Crimes Unit, to whom Roland had already made a preliminary disclosure. The third call was to Simone. I told her I needed her to come by the house the following Saturday for our regular check-in. I told her I had some questions about the quarterly summary she had prepared. I kept my voice exactly the way it had always been, warm, a little slow, a little tired. The voice of a father who trusted his daughter completely. She said she would be there at 10. She asked if Devin could join. I said of course, of course. That Friday night, Roland and I sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours, going over every detail of what Saturday would look like. Roland had coordinated with Detective Priasandi of the Mecklenburg County Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, who would be stationed outside in an unmarked vehicle on Sherwood Avenue. Roland himself would arrive at my house at 9:45 and wait in my study with the door ajar. We were not staging an ambush. We were creating conditions for truth to surface in the presence of witnesses, because that is the only kind of truth that holds up in the places that matter. I barely slept that Friday night, not from fear, from a kind of grief I don't have a precise name for. The grief of knowing that tomorrow something permanent was going to happen, that a door between my daughter and me, once it swung shut, might never fully open the same way again. I lay in the dark in the bedroom I had shared with Patricia for 34 years, and I talked to her the way I sometimes still do, quietly, without expecting an answer. I'm doing what you want me to do, Patty, I said to the ceiling. I'm handling it with my head, not my hands. I just wish you were here to tell me I'm right. The room stayed quiet, but somehow I slept. Saturday arrived cold and bright. The kind of November morning in Charlotte that feels more like early March, sharp air, pale blue sky, the oak trees along Sherwood Avenue stripped down to their essential shapes. Roland arrived at 9:45 as agreed, shook my hand in the doorway without a word, and took his position in the study. I made coffee. I set out the small wooden tray Patricia had always used for guests. 2 mugs, the sugar bowl, the small ceramic pitcher for cream. I set it in the center of the coffee table in the living room, the same room where the clock still sat on the mantel, the same clock that had quietly held my recorder 3 months before. Simone's white Honda Accord pulled into the driveway at 3 minutes past 10. Devin's silver Audi arrived 30 seconds later, packing at the curb. I watched them from the front window, my daughter in a burgundy coat, Devin in a gray jacket, the two of them walking up the path together with the comfortable ease of people who believe they are in control of a situation. Devin had a leather portfolio under his arm. He was already performing. I opened the front door before they knocked. "Morning, Daddy," Simone said, and kissed my cheek. She smelled like the same perfume she had worn since college, a light vanilla scent Patricia had introduced her to. I hugged her. I held it one beat longer than usual. "Morning, baby girl," I said. We settled in the living room. Devin placed his leather portfolio on the coffee table with the practiced confidence of a man who has run this kind of meeting before. He began talking about market conditions, about a rebalancing opportunity he and Simone had identified for the first quarter of the coming year, about how my current allocation was leaving value on the table. He spoke for about 4 minutes. He used phrases like capital efficiency and strategic repositioning. He never once looked uncertain. I let him finish. Then I set my coffee mug down on the tray, folded my hands in my lap, and said, "Devin, before we go any further, I want to share something with you both." I reached beneath the coffee table and lifted the manila folder I had placed there the night before. I set it on the table between us and opened it to the first page, the fidelity statements organized chronologically, with Dr. Stokes' annotations in red ink. $61,750, I said quietly. That's the amount that has been moved out of my retirement accounts since July of last year, through a checking account at Palmetto Citizens Federal Credit Union in Rock Hill, South Carolina. An account I did not open and have never accessed. The room went very still. Simone's face changed. It went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, and then something I recognized with painful clarity as the expression of a person deciding which version of a lie to tell. Devin's face, by contrast, did almost nothing. He simply looked at the folder with the flat, assessing eyes of a man running numbers. "Daddy, I can explain," Simone started. "I'm not finished," I said. The same quiet voice, the same folded hands. Alongside the financial records, Roland Hutchins, my attorney, has filed documentation with the Mecklenburg County DA's office. A forensic accounting report from Dr. Beverly Stokes on Morrison Boulevard. IP address records from Raymond James showing that my account alert thresholds were modified on September 14th from a device registered to Devin's South End address. Devin uncrossed his legs. It was the first physical reaction I had seen from him. And I continued. A recorded audio file from this living room, captured under North Carolina's one-party consent law, in which my daughter states, and I quote, "Daddy won't even notice. He's too old to keep track of that money anyway." The silence that followed those words was the longest I have ever sat inside. Simone's eyes filled with tears. Devin said nothing. Outside on Sherwood Avenue, a car door opened. Before I tell you what happened next, what my daughter said, what Devin did, and what I chose to do in that moment that changed everything, I have to ask, have you ever been the one holding evidence while the person you love is sitting right across from you? How do you hold yourself together? Tell me below. Subscribe if you're still with me. We're almost at the end of this story. Roland stepped out of the study at precisely that moment, as we had arranged, and introduced himself to Simone and Devin with the measured formality of a man who has done this many times over 31 years of practice. He placed 2 notarized letters on the coffee table, one for each of them, and explained in simple, clear language what they contained. The letters outlined the documented losses, the legal statute under which the matter had been filed, and a structured repayment agreement that Devin and Simone could sign voluntarily in lieu of proceeding directly to criminal charges. Devin picked up his letter, read the first paragraph, and set it back down. He looked at me for the first time that morning with something other than performance in his eyes. "Mr. Beaumont," he said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding here." "Devin," I said, "I was a structural engineer for 38 years. I know the difference between a misunderstanding and a load-bearing wall." He had nothing to say to that. Simone was crying now. Not the calculating tears I had feared, but something that looked real and frightened and young. The tears of a woman who had made a series of choices and was only now, at this exact moment, understanding their full weight. She looked at me and said, "Daddy, I'm sorry." I didn't. Devin said it would just be temporary, that we pay it back before you ever. Simone. My voice was soft. Stop. Don't explain it to me. Explain it to Roland. Detective Sandy came to the door at Roland's signal. Devin Ashford Price was formally interviewed that afternoon at the Mecklenburg County Police Department on East Trade Street. He was charged 6 weeks later with 1 count of financial exploitation of an elder adult and 1 count of wire fraud under North Carolina General Statute 14-113.2. His Pinnacle Capital Strategies, LLC, was investigated and found to be an unregistered entity that had been used in a similar scheme against at least one other elderly client in Richland County, South Carolina, a 71-year-old retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Odessa Lamar, who had lost $38,000 before the account was closed. Simone was not charged criminally. Roland negotiated a civil restitution agreement in which she agreed to repay her portion of the funds, $24,000, through a structured payment plan drawn against her own savings and a personal loan. She also surrendered all power of attorney and account access she had been granted. She did not contest any of it. Devin pled guilty in February to a reduced charge and was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation, ordered to pay $61,750 in restitution, and permanently barred from acting in any financial advisory capacity in the state of North Carolina. Pinnacle Capital Strategies, LLC, was dissolved. The Truist account in Rock Hill was frozen, and its remaining balance, $19,340, was returned to my Fidelity account within 60 days of the court order. Mrs. Odessa Lamar's case was reopened as a result of what Detective Sandy found during her investigation. I sent Mrs. Lamar a letter. I don't know if she ever wrote back. I hope she did. It has been 4 months since that Saturday morning on Sherwood Avenue. The oak trees have gone through winter and are beginning to show the first pale signs of April now. I had the mantel clock cleaned and serviced at a shop on Park Road. They told me it was a fine piece, well made, built to last. I thought that was a good description of a few things I believe in. Simone and I have spoken 7 times since November. The first 3 conversations were short and careful, the way conversations are when the ground beneath them is still uncertain. The 4th one lasted 2 hours. We cried, both of us. I told her about the 45 minutes I spent in Patricia's pew at Little Rock the Friday before everything happened. She told me that Devin had introduced the idea of the Rock Hill account as a temporary fund 6 months into their relationship, framing it as something she was doing for me, protecting my assets from tax exposure. He had told her, using language just technical enough, that she believed it because she wanted to believe it, because believing it meant she wasn't doing what she was actually doing. I don't know the full truth of how much she understood and how much she was manipulated. I suspect the answer is somewhere in between, in that complicated gray territory where love and weakness and bad choices live together. What I know is that she is my daughter. What I know is that Patricia asked me to let her help me, and I know that Patricia, with all her wisdom, could not have foreseen this. What I know is that I am 64 years old, and I have learned, the hard and permanent way, that love without accountability is not protection. It is permission. Gerald Okafor and I restructured my accounts in December. Everything is now under sole individual access, with quarterly paper statements mailed to both my address and Roland's office. My monthly Fidelity distribution is back to its original amount. The $19,340 returned from the frozen account went directly into a CD at First Horizon Bank on Providence Road, where it will sit untouched for 2 years. On Christmas morning, Simone came to the house alone. She brought sweet potato pie, not her mother's recipe, because she never learned it, but a version she had found and made herself, with brown sugar and a cinnamon crust that was close enough to make me sit quietly for a moment before I ate it. We had dinner at the table where Patricia used to sit. We did not talk about any of it. We talked about Hampton, about the church anniversary coming in the spring, about whether I should finally sell Patricia's Volvo or keep it another year. I told her I thought I'd keep it another year. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I want to leave you with this. I installed that recorder because I was afraid of what I might hear. What I heard was painful, in a way I do not have words adequate to describe. The voice of your own child, filtered through a 2-inch speaker, saying that you are too old and too blind to protect yourself. There is no preparation for that. There is no way to rehearse how that lands. But here is what I also know. That recorder gave me the truth. And the truth, as hard as it was, gave me something back that I didn't know I had lost until I found it again. It gave me clarity. It gave me the ability to act with precision and dignity, rather than wound and rage. It gave me the chance to handle the worst moment of my fatherhood the way Patricia would have wanted me to handle it, with patience, with strategy, and with enough grace at the end to leave a door open. A man I respected once told me that character is not what you do when things are easy. It is what you do when everything you trusted turns out to be a question. I have thought about that sentence many times over the past 4 months. I do not know if I did everything right. I know I did not do it out of hatred or revenge. I did it because the truth deserved to be in the light, and because my pension, 38 years of early mornings and late nights and weekends away from my family, deserved to be protected. Hindsight, they say, is 20/20. What I'd add is this. Sometimes the clearest view comes from the quietest room, with a small recorder and the courage to press play. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with me until the end of this story. It was not an easy one to tell. If it touched something in you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. A parent, a friend, anyone who has ever loved someone so much they stop protecting themselves. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that wisdom and patience are still the most powerful tools a person can carry. Leave your like and tell me in the comments, what would you have done differently? I want to hear from you. God bless, and I'll see you in the next story.